Dear students, dear guests, welcome to our joint seminar, Human Rights and Introduction. This course is a partnership between the Global Awareness Education at the University of Tübingen in Germany and the Federal University of ABC in Brazil. This course aims to make the topic of human rights accessible to students of all disciplines and from different countries. We will study the history of human rights and look at specific issues related to refugees, public security, gender, minorities, and the role of the arts, focusing on experiences in different parts of the world. Guest lecturers will bring fresh perspectives from different disciplines and regions of the world. At both universities, the course is being offered to students from different disciplines. In Tübingen, as part of the Global Awareness Education in the Transdisciplinary Course Program, and as a free extension course at the Federal University of ABC. The course organizers are Professor Gilberto Rodrigues from the Federal University of ABC and myself, Glaucia Pérez da Silva from the University of Tübingen. Today, we will hear a lecture on gender and diplomacy, challenges and opportunities by Ambassador Irene Vida Gala from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in São Paulo, Brazil. I will give the words to Gilberto to introduce our guest.
Thank you, Glaucia. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to come back here in this virtual session, and a great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Irene Vida Gala, who holds a law degree from the University of São Paulo and began her diplomatic career in 1986. She has held various positions in Brazil, including director of the African Division and head of the Africa Division 2. She also served on missions and official visits to Lisbon, Luanda, Pretoria, New York, Rome, and Accra. In particular, during her time in New York, she followed African issues in the United Nations Security Council. Academically, she holds a master's degree in international relations and has completed the Rio Branco Institute course of advanced studies. She's currently the Deputy Chief of the Representative Office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in São Paulo, Brazil. It's important also to stress that Ambassador Vida Gala is leadership in gender and diplomacy in our country, in Brazil, and president of the Association of Brazilian Women Diplomats. I would like also to add that Ambassador Vida Gala has supported many activities in universities in Brazil. She's a good friend of us in very many projects, and she is an inspiration not only for women, but also for men in Brazil. So thank you very much, Ambassador Vida Gala, to join us in this course. It's a great honor and a pleasure to receive you in this course. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here. It's good English because you don't have to put gender when you say you, because when it comes to Portuguese, our first challenge is, should we say good morning to you in Portuguese, you in English, or you that's neutral? So you have this. English makes it easier. But if you go to French, I don't know German, but some other languages would be the first challenge. How do we introduce ourselves? And talking about introduction, let me try a self-description of myself. Of course, for self-description, I'm a 62-year-old lady, white hair. I have it hanging a tail. I'm dressed in warm clothes because it's cold now in Brazil, and I have a bookshelf behind of me. I'm at home. When I try to describe myself or do some kind of description, I like to go beyond what we see, because there is much beyond that. And when Professor mentioned that, Professor Gilberto mentioned my CV, he made reference to my large experience in Africa. And that's quite relevant to the place where I am now, because being a Brazilian, you are, first of all, connected to the reality of being in a country where the majority of the people is Black. But when you go to Africa, that's where I did most of my career, dealing with Africans and African relations, Brazil-African relations, then I fully understood what to be Black really means. And I even decided to write a piece of paper on how I found myself with the real experience of living with Blacks. I think this is relevant when we are talking in a course that's about human rights. In Brazil, we are definitely very much engaged with this discussion on human rights, and I'll explore a little bit more of this during this my speech, or during this time we talk to this group. I would like to, of course, I will bring this issue of being Black more frequently later on, and maybe it may sound reasonable to make reference to the fact that many people, I'm a white woman, I didn't say that, but many people, due to the fact that I'm very much committed in Brazil to the fight against racism, people tend to see me as a Black woman. And it's quite interesting when people ask me, what's your experience of being a Black woman in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil? So I decided to start with this because it's difficult to find a place where you really are. I'm Brazilian in a country where you have Blacks, but I don't understand the issue of being Black when I was in Africa. I'm seen as a Black woman, but I'm a white woman. But then it comes to being a woman. We talk about human rights as something that's universal. And when we talk about gender, of course, gender is not really only women. But when we come to women, we have nothing more universal than men and women. Of course, with gender associated with this, how you are inside a society, what is the gender? And but I'm talking about sex. You have the possibility of being a woman, and then are you what? And when it comes to a universal woman, is she the same everywhere? And it's interesting because when we ask this, is she the same woman everywhere? We bring it to the international scene, and then we start talking on the subject of my discussion here with you, that is gender and diplomacy. Let's start by women in international affairs. And then my initial remarks are, women are about the same everywhere, but we face quite different challenges. And my point would be, you being from different countries, what you believe to be the biggest challenge of a woman in your country? Just think of that, either being a woman or being a man. Try to write it, and then afterwards you tell me, what's the biggest challenge for a woman in your country? In my country, the biggest challenge to be a woman is to be alive the next day, because we have one of the highest numbers or levels of crimes against women just for the fact that they are women. So for most of us, our biggest concern is what we can do to make women survive. Of course, we can think about many other issues before coming to the very last end, that is death. How women can survive in their everyday struggle to exist. It can be in the financial aspect. How do they work in terms of how can they live in a society where most of the population is poor. In Brazil, for instance, most of the families, the majority of families in Brazil are supported by women, not by men. So how are women dealing with this challenge to take food to the family's table? Of course, we have other challenges. That is, how do you can really be what you want to be? And then we come to gender. You have different kinds of women. And can we be exactly what we want to be, either homosexual, transsexual, whatever? So all this, and then I will just make reference to something that I heard one day. And of course, when we talk about human rights and this kind of things, it's so sensitive that you can easily make mistakes, but we shall never be afraid of making mistakes. When we see that among us, there is a connection on improve the position of human rights. So even those who make mistakes, if we understand that we are on the same level in terms of trying to improve, I think we can try and even take the risk of making mistakes. But again, let me tell you one story. Once I was working at the Brazilian consulate in Rome. And in Rome, in Italy, there is a big number of Brazilian professionals of sex, prostitutes, we say. But we have both male and female prostitutes. And we have people who are not transgender, but who look like, I don't know the word in English, but they present themselves as women, although they are men. The idea that people who would come to the consulate, their papers would be completely male names and all, but they would be with a boyfriend, they would all be dressed like women. Anyway, but we have also, by that time, there was a very interesting circumstances. Many Brazilians would go to Italy to do their operations, their surgeries, to change sex. And it was interesting because one of the leaders, maybe the biggest, the most active one of the Brazilian community in Rome, she was a transgender. She had made the surgery from being a man to becoming a woman. And then with her, I learned a lot about, well, I had no information about that. And I asked her, why is it? It looks to me that most of the transgenders that I meet, that I know about, they are women. We don't know about men who are transgender. So women who became men. And then this lady who has been working on this subject, she was even a member, or she ran for the European Parliament, a Brazilian. And she said, look, women who become men, they become majority. So they tend to be quiet. They don't speak out about their conditions. But if you are a man and you become a woman, then you definitely become part of the minority and you are going to talk about it. So this is quite interesting because you see that the situation of being a woman makes it a kind of a constraint, even when you change sex and become a woman. But anyway, so after telling you the story, I'll come back to my initial point. So women and diplomacy. I think we can always talk about gender, but it would be a very specific part of it. So I will mainly concern about women. And then we can also discuss at a later stage how the fact of having women leading the issue or some issues in the international sphere, how that may help the circumstance or the conditions of other minorities. Okay, I told you about my experience in Rome with part of the Brazilian community, but I also want to tell you how I became somehow interested in this issue of women in the international area. I was posted to Angola, Luanda, during the war in the mid-90s of last century. I was there, it was, the war was full speed. It was soon after the end of the Cold War. and the situation was really bad in terms of the war. And there, for the first time, I heard something that I think was very, very much responsible for what I am now. At that time, in the mid-90s, there was nothing like the resolution that was approved by the UN in 2000 about human peace and security. In the 90s, and particularly in Africa, where I was, but not only in Africa, after the end of the Cold War, there was a period, about a decade of wars. So the end of the Cold War made all the wars come up, and the end of the bipolar conflict was over, and then all small conflicts in the world started to spread. And in Africa, there was a big number of wars, national conflicts. And then Angola was one of these cases. And then there I heard this following statement. Women don't send their children and the husbands to war. Women don't send their children and the husband to the war. And why were they saying that? Because in the 90s, together with the wars, there were many movements, to try to stop wars. So there were all experiences in building peace agreements. 1940 was the beginning of the Black regime in Africa, the end of the apartheid regime. So you had many other conflicts that were trying to be resolved after negotiations. And the fact is that women were never part of the negotiations. You only could see men trying to sit down and try to set the agreement. And it's interesting because they were not the women. Women were not part of the negotiations, but they wanted to be. And there is one very interesting story. In the 90s, 2 Liberian ladies were given the Nobel Prize of Peace, Nobel Peace Prize. So they were the president of Liberia and one pacifist, one woman who was leading a peace movement. And her name is Leymah Gbowee. Leymah Gbowee, she was, I don't know if some of you know her, but I think her story is fantastic when we come to this discussion on gender and diplomacy. Because when nobody was looking at women to try to bring peace to these countries, Leymah, she was leading this movement and trying to make women in her country to be part of the negotiations. So when she won the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize, if you read it, there are 2 main actions that everybody tells about her. The first one is she managed to conduct and lead a sex strike with women of her country. She managed to make women stop making sex with their husbands or partners. You can imagine how strong this is. This is quite, I think, it's difficult to understand nowadays. And she managed to bring women together and make this an issue. And the second point, in this movement that she was leading, in Africa, people they don't wear white clothes. But she led a movement of women dressed in white, particularly in West Africa. They were all together sitting outside the main block of the building where men were discussing peace for Liberia. And then she said, with her group, you have to make an agreement because we are sitting outside this building and in all doors, there is no food coming in, there is no water getting into the building. And when you have no more water and no more food, you have to sign a deal. Otherwise, you die inside this building. So I think this is so interesting because she brought 2 different ways of making women part of the negotiation process. She rose awareness to the subject And then all these women together, they made it a kind of a strong pressure. And of course, there was peace after this. I always tell people when I make reference to this, it sounds so odd that we will say, that's not true. It's true. That's why she won a Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize. And so it's interesting because this was in mid-90s. Soon after that, the issue became so strong that the United Nations had to discuss this issue. And in 2000, October 2000, the Security Council of the United Nations approved a resolution discussing, or that is women, peace and security. So in this resolution, the international community comes together to say, women must be part of all solutions in terms when we want to build peace. In this resolution, and all that comes after that in terms of studies, research, there is clear evidence that when women make part or are part of the negotiation process, they can look at issues that normally men don't look at. And these issues are very relevant to the consolidation of peace. So studies show that when women are part of the negotiation process, peace tends to last more than when men are just the ones dealing with the solution. And that's quite obvious. Why is that obvious? Because when we are talking about half of the population, that's women. When we talk about half of the population, what you see up to 2000, the international world was being built, discussed. All this was, there were all these discussions on what to do in terms of the international relations without the participation of women. And then you are going to say, no. There were some women who were prime ministers. We had Margaret Thatcher. We had other ladies. Well, you had the Queen of England that was head of state. Well, there are other women, but it's such a small number that we can always, we have always to consider how influenced these women can be when surrounded by men. This is an issue. You cannot look at one woman and say that she is responsible for X, Y, and Z, because she'll definitely be surrounded by men. There is one very interesting and quite recent situation. And it's interesting because some of you are in Germany. I have been talking about this in Brazil, and maybe one of you are going to study the issue. And because as far as I know, nobody is looking at it. I will make reference to Angela Merkel. And I will invite you to think about her responsibility, her role in keeping Europe in peace for such a long period. We know that after the Second World War, this is the longest period that Europe has been in peace or without an open conflict inside the continent or the part of the continent inside Europe. So if I'm talking about women being efficient in dealing with peace, because they can look at the concerns of half of the population that have been overlooked, let's put some kind of light in Angela Merkel. We see the situation in Russia and Ukraine. I think all of you may have, I'm sure, all of you have an idea about this war, particularly because those who are in Europe are feeling war very close. So I believe you are concerned about it. But I think all of you also know that this issue of the war in the region has been in the agenda for a while. So my point is there any connection? I don't have the answer. I have a guess, but this has to be studied. And my guess is, or I would ask this question, is there any possibility that Angela Merkel, being a woman and being responsible or in charge of politics of the main country in Europe, that's Germany, is it possible that she was the one taking peace longer, taking peace ahead, and avoiding conflict? I think that I do deserve the benefit of doubt. In Portuguese, we say benefício da dúvida. I don't know if in English you can say, if you understand benefits of doubt. I think that unless people study the issue and show me that there is no connection between the fact that it was Angela Merkel in the presidency and the fact that war came, or the invasion by Russia, the situation in Ukraine came only after she left. And then you say, well, but we have other women in Europe, and they, for instance, Ursula von der Leyen, and well, she has been quite effective in pushing for this conflict. Not pushing for the conflict, but I don't see her, and that's my perspective, speaking too strong about peace. Anyway, I just brought you this idea that when we talk about women and international politics, the main idea that comes is how women can be more effective than men in making peace a reality and making equality a reality. I push now the word equality because in Brazil, look, the international scene is not very, yet there are not many studies and research on this. But in internal politics, we do have some studies, at least in Brazil. I'm sure in other countries there will be something alike. But we have research in Brazil showing that women, when they are leading municipalities, so when they are mayors or something like that, they tend to be more effective in spending public money and spending in terms of delivering social goods. They are going to be more effective in making better deliveries on education, health, public transportation. So women are very much associated now, according to research, with more effective government. So if we think about effectiveness in government and success, or some kind of success in terms of peace, we tend to make it stronger, this idea that maybe women can be important in the international scenery. I will bring to you, I believe most of you are quite young compared to me, but we had the pandemic, COVID-19, some 3 years ago or 4 years ago. And it's one of the issues that was always raised was the fact that countries that were dealing, or some of the countries that were best prepared or were more efficient in combating COVID, were countries led by women. And one of the top, that was the current reference, was New Zealand, and it was a woman. It's interesting because after the COVID period, she had just had a baby. She was a mother of a young baby when she was the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And soon after, she quit politics. To a certain extent, people said that she could not deal with violence. Because when we talk about women and politics, international or national, we talk about violence against women, political violence. So I'm bringing to you what is, I believe, a very common picture everywhere, in every country. When we go to Western democracies, we have the understanding that women are in a better position. But when we come to numbers, we still see them not very well represented. They are more represented, for instance, than countries in Latin America, in Brazil. but they are still very few. We are not even close to half of prime ministers in Europe being, or in the Western countries, Western developed countries, being women. So when it comes to power, we still see, oh, it's a male business. But if you leave Western Europe and if we go to Asia, maybe then we get to a worse situation in terms of representation. Now Brazil is the leader, now is the head of, now leads the G20. And so we are having some meetings in Brazil. And one of the meetings that has just taken place was one about women, the G20 Women Caucus meeting. And then the numbers came to show that in terms of representation in parliament, Brazil is the second worst, but worse than Brazil is Japan. So look what you see in Asia. And it's interesting because we hardly hear about Asia on these issues. But you see some countries, particularly Arab countries, that are bringing women to the international scenery, a little bit like we are doing something and these women can. And it's quite interesting because I have the opportunity to meet a minister of the Arab Emirates. She had gone to university in the United States. She was completely Western. She had all the profile of a Western woman, but she was an Arab woman. And but she has such a strong position in terms of representation of her country. And it's interesting because women can be used just to show off. Men can use women just to make the presentation or to be a kind of token, as we say. They are there just to be the image of women. But when we come to Africa, we see many more women. And why? Because these women, in the very recent process of independence of these countries, that is, well, less than 100 years old, 70 years old, 60 years old, these countries, women were important in the revolutionary process. And then they somehow managed to be part of the new governments, but still they are behind. But that's a place in Africa where you see women. And women that are there because of the work they do. And it's quite different from, for instance, Brazil or Latin America, where women are in politics most of the time because they are connected to men in politics. They are wives, they are daughters of. So those women who are part of the social movement, the political movement, who come from the grassroots, political grassroots movements, they are very few. So that's more or less the picture of what you see or what you don't see. You don't see women in the international tables. You don't see women mainly in developing theories about international relations. And that's what really concerns me most, because we are talking about the design, the understanding, the conception of the world that's done under male circumstances, under male understanding of the world. And that cannot be always like that. We have to change that because we have different perspectives. Recently, I wanted to bring, well, I believe some of you may be from the international relations area, but not all of you. And I wanted to discuss this issue, or to understand this issue of women in international politics when it comes to tough subjects. Because it's okay to bring women to the table to discuss cooperation, to discuss cultural, to discuss even some kind of let's say, issues associated with immigrants. Okay, but when it comes to hard politics, that's war and peace, you always find men. Security issues is a male-dominated area. And then I want to read a little bit about nuclear issues and women, how we women look at this. And then there is a very interesting text written by an American lady. She decided to join a group of researchers dealing only on nuclear issues. So it was nuclear security, nuclear power, and so on. And it's amazing. It's amazing to read her text. She explains, well, at the end, she says, I had to a certain extent, she said, I was completely washed. I had a brainwash to think like them. But she was so much concerned about her research that she could see both sides. But she said, I was driven into a world that's a male world. And what did she say that is easy for us to understand? Most of the language, and this is something easy to, that really takes you when you're reading that. Most of the language of nuclear security is associated with sexual issues. It's male-dominated and sexually oriented. You have, for instance, places where you hide the rockets with nuclear ogives. They are somehow called with the names of women and how women are open to receive that. It's a kind of I don't know how to explain it in English, but it's kind of the idea is sexual intercourse. This is amazing. I want to deal on this, but I really recommend that you look at this and how. And one of the things that on another perspective she mentions is that they look at this, the ones who are dealing with this, as just an issue. They don't think about lives. They don't think about who are the ones. When you talk about 4,000 ogivs or 4,000 nuclear bombs, what is the difference that 2,000 and 4,000 or 1,000 or just 50 make? But they don't think about that. They don't see who are going to be affected by the discussions they are taking. And that brings me back to Angola and the women who said, women don't send the children and the husbands to the war. I like to keep this as an idea for me to work on this battle that is now my challenge. And what is my challenge? How we bring women to the table. First of all, we have to raise awareness about the fact that women are not there, but they want to be. And they want to be, and how do we know they want to be? Because more and more women are coming to the screen, they are coming to politics to say, we want to be part of international politics. In terms of diplomats, since the United Nations created or approved this resolution about women, peace, and security, there has been more and more discussions on the subject. But still, it's kind of men looking at how can put women in the photo, how women will be there, but they will not be entirely responsible for the discussion. But then there is something quite interesting that took place recently. And as a matter of fact, I'm talking about 2014, when in Sweden, the government of Sweden decided to create something that's called feminist external policy. So it's an external policy, international relations for one country, external policy, that is conceived with the idea of gender. And this is so interesting because it's a new concept. When the Swedish, they came with this feminist foreign policy, people were looking at them, and immediately in Europe, other countries started to replicate, particularly progressist groups, not conservative groups, but progressist groups. And then in the world, people start looking at that and saying, particularly women, and say, what is this? And who is benefiting from that? And then discussing about perspectives that you are looking at this. Women in the South, they were looking at these women leading foreign policy, and they were just asking, but what are you changing in terms of real politics? What are you? It's just a matter of being part of the photo. It's just a matter of putting some money, what's quite relevant. But the idea was, let's give the Swedish, for instance, they said there were 3 R's: representation, so more women, resources, more money to cooperation in international arena, in other countries, in order to improve the conditions of women. And the other one was rights, to discuss about rights of women. So women in the South, they said, well, you are doing all this, but as a matter of fact, nothing changes in terms of the international system. We are still subordinated in this international scene, and this is a very Western agenda. We want to discuss this from our perspective. And now there's this very interesting discussion, and in Latin America and in Africa, I don't know about Asia, I haven't heard anything about Asia. There are some experiments of feminist foreign policies from a different perspective, where the discussion leads to other positions. So this is an issue just for you to look at. But it's interesting because at the UN, when there is the General Assembly, now, since last year, there is a meeting of ministers of foreign affairs of countries that are now supporting a feminist foreign policy. So this is just a new drive, is a new option for those who want to look at the participation of women and the interests of women in the international scene. I don't have much more time. I'll just bring this exactly to Brazil. Where are we in Brazil? In our foreign affairs, we are just 23% of women. But we don't have equal representation in important positions. We have several challenges because there is no special conditions for you to be a woman and also a diplomat in terms of maternity. If you decide to be a mother, and most of women are going to be mothers, you don't have any special condition to continue being a diplomat, and don't lose the track compared to your colleagues. So the fact is, we now, in our association, we want to, first of all, we want to raise awareness to the fact that, yes, there are women in our foreign service, and we want to be part of the group of leaders of our ministry. We want to have important missions abroad. We want to be part of the discussions, and we don't want to be just in lower positions. Even with the same qualification, men take the place instead of women. So we want to change this. And we have been talking to colleagues, for instance, in Latin America. 2 days ago, I was talking to women diplomats in Ecuador. They all have the same problems. So now, if we want to change, and let's, for those who are in Brazil, we now have a government that's progressive, Lula. And he made quite clear that he was going to promote women in leadership, women in politics. But what we see is that this is not really happening. So we have challenges. And what are these challenges? And that's what I bring to you, and then we will finish. The point is, we can have some kind of progressive leadership, but we are under a serious harassment of conservative forces. And conservative forces, they really love to look at women as their kind of best enemy. In Europe, there is one enemy. In Europe, you have the situation of immigrants. But when it goes to immigrants, the one next in terms of conservative is right of women. And we see this when we talk about reproductive rights, when we talk about representation in parliament or in any kind of levels of government. But when we come to the South, to patriarchal societies and structures, then it's even worse. So what we have now as a big challenge in Brazil, and some of you here are Brazilians, is the fact that we have churches all over the world that are very much associated with a conservative agenda, very, very concerned about reproductive rights and the role of women. They want to send women back home. They don't want women in the public sphere. So I keep saying, when I talk to people here in Brazil, when I talk about women's rights and how we want to be in politics, I say, every time there is something you hear that says women must be home, either to take care of the family, take care of the children, whatever. This is a movement to take you out, to take women out of the public sphere. So we have to be very, very careful with this. And of course, we have some men here also listening to us. What's the role of men in all this? First of all, you have to be sensitive to the fact that we are as brilliant, as intelligent, as dedicated as men are, but we don't have the same opportunities. And this is so sad, because the world is not making good use of lots of talents. And we want to make a better world, I guess. I think this is some kind of natural commitment of all of us, or some of us. But I think those who are in this course tend to believe that we can make some kind of improvements in the world. So you men who are in this course, you have to be sensitive to the fact that by ignoring the position, the presence, and the contribution of women, we are not making or creating the conditions to improve the world, because we are leaving behind, we are putting apart half of the talent that the world has conceived. If you are religious, that God has given the earth. I'm not religious, but anyway. So what I tell you, men, is look at us as partners in this work. And at the end of the day, you are the ones who still have the keys of these doors who are close to women. So you have to be generous. I don't like the word generous. Some women will tell, we don't want men to be generous because we are fighting. It's true, we are fighting. But I don't want to die before the end of the fight. So it will make things much easier if, instead of seeing all of us dying before we can really drop the door, make it out of our way, it's much easier if we agree that it's better to open the door for women. So at this stage, I will just make a final remark for us to talk and discuss and the questions. If we have a challenge that's conservative opinion, we have maybe, for instance, for us in Brazil, for some other countries, but I think in Western world as well, we still have to keep democracy going. We still need democracy to survive. Because when there is democracy, I can at least shout. I can at least bring my voice to the table and try to create some kind of understanding among my peers. If there is no democracy, I'll be shut inside the house. So in many countries, for instance, if we look at Zimbabwe, there is one leader of opposition that she was jailed for some years because she could not be part of the political process. You see in Venezuela, and you said, oh, you're taking two countries. No, I'm just saying that we have several difficult situations everywhere. We also had some women leaders in Venezuela, they could not go ahead with their political positions. There was some, I'm not discussing on the point what they are raising. The fact is that they are women, and violence against women in politics is becoming quite normal. So let me end here, bringing all this together to the point that personally, I'm committed to the point. I raise my awareness being with women who raise the importance of women being part of the political process. I decided to engage with this when I saw in my own country the situation of women dying and the need to change this. And the fact that we are only going to change the position of these women who are daily dying when, to a certain extent, I can be part of the process and change the rules, change the circumstances. So I want, in the international level, to be part of a process that is engaging many of us. And those who are here, men and women, you have to join us. Thank you very much. Well, there's a lot has changed, fortunately. But I would say that the change is associated with a period of time that was quite interesting in the Brazilian history. By the end of the 80s, we were approving our constitution. That's called the Constituição Cidadã. It's the constitution of all citizens in English. We would translate into something like that. So that was the time after the end of dictatorship in Brazil, when we really could think of something that was new in terms of rights. And if we had a constitution now, it would really not be like that. It would be terribly bad and conservative. And what we see in parliament nowadays is changes in order to stop rights or to avoid rights or to extinguish rights that we made possible in that constitution. And when I'm talking about rights, I'm talking about economic rights and, of course, when it comes to social rights as well. But what has definitely changed from the 80s to now is the fact that many more people are talking about it. Grassroots movements are growing. And in the 80s, let's think that you may not have this in your mind, and Brazilians of your age, we had very few people who were educated. We still do not have many people educated in Brazil. But at that time, it was much, much less. The levels of illiteracy, but also the number of people who could attend high school were very, very little in Brazil. So by that time, people were ready to just accept what was presented to them as a given. You are in this position because you were Black, because you were a woman, and that's how it is. But now, when you bring awareness to people, you make what we see now is really a grassroots movements, much stronger and more effective in presenting their fights. It's interesting because in my first presentation, I did not mention, and I did it because I thought it would be better to raise this issue when answering the questions. I didn't mention the issue of Black women and indigenous women. Of course, their reality is even worse than the reality of a white woman. Black women die more when there is, for instance, what we call feminicide. I don't know what is the word in English, but when it's a crime against women just because they are a woman, normally by some kind of relative, the husband or some boyfriend or something like that. When it comes to numbers of Black women killed in these circumstances, it's almost the double of white women. So when it comes to politics, the political representation of Black women is much, much smaller than even the white women. And when it comes to indigenous women, they are not there. Indigenous women are not there. So we have to, when you ask, what are the new challenges, or what are the challenges? We did pretty well raising this issue. The challenge now is to keep it going. How can we, because in physics, we say every action, there is a reaction. The fact that awareness and fights for rights rose to another level in the 21st century brought this huge reaction against us. So I think that what we have to do is to keep talking, and there must be a serious commitment of young ladies and men in order to keep this issue under the spotlight. And it's very interesting because when people are discussing the stream right, the increase of the stream right, it's quite common people just say that, well, this is a little bit of responsibility of identitarian movements or women, blacks, all kinds of LGBTQI letters, because they are being too, or we, women, blacks, and so we are raising too much this issue, we are bringing this to the forefront of the political scene, and then the reaction is the extreme right. I think this is so unfair, and this is again a tool, an instrument of men to keep power with them. It's so easy to take our fight as part of the responsibility of something that's out of this. When we see in Brazil and all this, you see, and when you see in Europe, the issue of immigrants, the issue of people, inequality in the United States, for instance, this is not associated with the identity issues. This is associated with economic issues, with how efficient the economic system is. So why do men, because I don't see women saying that it's our movements that are raising the stake for the stream right. It's men who come with this. So stop. We all have to be aware of it and do not be a prey to this. We can't accept this. We have to definitely say, we want democracy to survive. We want to fight the stream right, but we are not going to give up our fight. Our issues are relevant. It's exactly the opposite. Make fairness, make equal representation, make inclusion more real in politics, and we'll have less opportunities for the extreme right. There was an improvement, but as a consequence, now the fight is much harder. I think in the 80s there was, go with the flow, that the movement is positive for us to start this new trend. And nowadays we have really to be ready to take this issue ahead, because there is a lot of opposition that in the 90s, I think it was there, but it was much smaller. Now I feel so ashamed by the fact that people can openly say all kinds of stupid things. And there is no responsibility with being stupid. You can just be stupid because you have the condition to be stupid. And you are popular because you say stupid things. And because you make comments that are aggressive, well, they're going to harass other people. And let me just end this with something that I read yesterday that was so wonderful. Because when you see these people just so free to say all kinds of aggressive words, you have ways to fight back or to respond if you don't use to have aggressive language. And then I bring the case of Vinicius Junior. Vini Junior, for those who are in Europe, he's a Brazilian footballer, a soccer player. And yesterday there was a decision in court in Spain, sending to prison for 8 months some men, well, some supporters of a soccer club, some supporters, because they had some kind of racist language. And that has been quite frequent in Europe. And then everybody's saying, well, Vinicius Junior, he's a victim of racism, he's a victim of racism. And yesterday, when there was this decision, he completely subverted the narrative. He said, I'm not a victim of racism. I'm the hangman, the executioner of racists. This is huge. I'm not the victim. I'm the one who is going to put all these guys behind bars. So I love that. So we can always change the narrative, and he did it. We have to see what is the space of women in politics. When in democracies, what we are, I mean, Brazil, Europe, and other countries in Latin America, we're talking about democracies. When we look at this condition, we have political parties, and the political parties are dominated by men. So those women who will be part of the political process will be the ones who are ready to speak the same language of men. When it comes to Angela Merkel, that was the reference that I made, she had just the most important country in Europe in her hands. She spent lots of years in the leadership. So she could, I think she was the only case of a woman that could tailor her party and tailor politics according to her views. I don't see any other experience like that, where women take the responsibility of defining the strategy. Of course, she had to negotiate with men, but at the same time, she was related with more women, and she brought more women into the picture. When we come to all other countries that I know, you have women, we have women that are part of a male political process. And so if you tend to be more affirmative in terms of making a difference out of the male perception and male guidelines, you'll be out of the process. You're not going to be in the process. So that's why I like quotas. I like quotas and I like affirmative action, because you have the message to women that they are going to be there. And men are going to, and those who are leading the process, men who are leaders in the political process, they'll have to be much more persuasive in terms of convincing women to reproduce their speech. We are talking about narratives. We are disputing narratives. And women have to reproduce male narratives. So when are we going to give representation to women, but together with that, the possibility of speaking their own voice? We are going to be able to speak our own voice when we are together, surrounded by female partners, when we have the issue of gender as part of the political process. I want people voting because you are a woman and because you are presenting issues and an agenda that's relevant for women. Women vote for women, but not because you are just one woman, but because the language of that woman is the one that you want to listen. And it's interesting because when we see in politics, for instance, in Brazil, even women from different political parties and political groups, there are some issues that they can merge and work together and have differences. So it's interesting because although the examples are not too many, but you see that when you have all the women around you, you feel strong to speak your voice. And it's so interesting. We have in Brazil a senator, Teresa Cristina. She used to be a minister of Bolsonaro in Bolsonaro's government. And she has never spoken about women issues. Never. I never saw, at least. And now, when we had the president of Mexico, a woman being elected, it was so interesting because she came to her Twitter to speak about the importance of women in leadership. I said, there is a little bit of a change. Why is this? Because maybe, well, of course, she looks ahead. She may be one day a candidate for the presidency. But she understood that raising the woman flag would be something relevant for her career. That's what we want. We want her to be committed to women issues. And we don't need to have only honest women. We want to have political women. We want women who understand that they have to be committed to a certain agenda to have votes. And this is not the one of men. So we are talking about politics. We tend to have an understanding that due to the fact that women are raised in a certain way, I'm not being determinist by the fact that you are a woman by when you were born, that you are a woman by sex. I'm saying that you are educated to behave in a certain way, that's the female way, to be a social woman, let's say, in the social area. So when we are raised like this, we tend to develop some characteristics that lead us to a more cooperative agenda. Women tend to be more oriented to raising understanding. And it's funny, when I talk to students in lectures, I always say, look at your mother and your father and try to see when there is some kind of course, there are exceptions, but normally when you have trouble at home, normally it will be woman, the mother, who will try to kind of accommodate. It used to be like this when I was a child, but I think it's still very much the experience. Of course, things have changed, but so I think that, and then coming to the neoliberal agenda, that is connected with the fact that where women are finding space, they are finding a space in the private scenery, they are finding space in enterprises, they are finding space in ESG, all this agenda that's very much associated with the business. You see women in trade, you see women being CEOs in committees of enterprises, and women who are there, they're leading a neoliberal agenda. But we also have a lot of women in the grassroots movements, and they are very much anti-liberal. They are very much associated with agendas that are rethinking all this. So I think that what we see, but it's because there is a lot of money put on that to highlight the efficiency of women in the private sector in a neoliberal agenda. And the other difference is I was invited to join what is called the Club 13% of women in councils of administrations in enterprises. And they invited me here in Brazil to join. And I said, okay, I will go if I can always speak about the place of women in the public scene. I won't be raising the issue of private, of business. And then I said, maybe you should reconsider the invitation. And they didn't invite me again. So it's funny because I have my agenda, I have my message, and we cannot change that. Well, as I said, if I were speaking the language of men, the ones who want us to join them, I wouldn't be now the president of the association. We are the voice of those who don't see themselves represented in the Brazilian foreign policy, in the Brazilian foreign ministry. And we are, let's say, not the ones they like. Our leaders, they don't recognize our, for instance, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, he never received us to talk to us. He doesn't want to see us because we name and shame. That's what we have to do. If I were there just to be a nice girl or a nice lady, I wouldn't be the representative of and more than 70% of Brazilian diplomats are members of our association. So they want us to speak and to speak out and name and shame. And that's what we do. So we don't have the protagonism that we would like to have. And we have been talking louder and louder about it. Well, first of all, congratulations for saying that you are a future diplomat. I'm happy to hear that. And please go ahead. It's a lot of study, but I think it's worth trying. Anytime you want to, we can talk here in São Paulo. I'm in São Paulo. Professor Gilberto can connect us. It will be my pleasure. But anyway, my experience. When I joined Foreign Service 40 years ago, there were no women who could be a kind of a role model. There were no women. Women are in Itamaraty since 1918. I know that in the chat, there was a reference to the documentary. There is translation in English in the documentary. So I highly recommend you to see it. It's a 52-minute documentary. And it's interesting to tell the story of Brazilian women in diplomacy. But the fact is, when I joined, there were no women ambassadors. So there were no role models. There had been some women in the 50s, but after the 50s, there was a stop. There was a kind of, it was prohibited to have women in the career. Women were requested to leave when they were married. So there was a kind of gap. When I joined, there were no women. So there were no role models. And the fact here is that we were just as everybody. I normally say I was a man. I happened to be, we were women, but we could not raise we were not allowed to raise the issue of being a woman. But it's so interesting because my group, in our group, there were 40 people. As a matter of fact, 44 and 10 women. It's so interesting because 10 makes a group. We had a kind of a bond among us. And it's so, so relevant. I say that my role model are my colleagues. And out of 10, 6 of us managed to get to the position of a full range ambassadors. So you see that 60%, and one lady could certainly have been the 7th, but she had a tragic death when she was one step below ambassador. So, but out of 9, we have 6 ambassadors. I don't see any male group, any male group of year that had these numbers, so positive numbers. So you see how relevant it was the fact that we were many. We could support each other. We didn't have to perform like men. We were performing as ourselves, and we were fighting with the support of others. I remember that when I was in my first year, it was so difficult. It was so difficult that I had the intention to drop, to leave, because it was really difficult, for several reasons, not the part of the schooling system it was difficult, the relations, all kinds of, the environment was difficult. And I was about to drop. And then I had one colleague who was a lady, a colleague of mine who was also a woman. And she came to me and said, no, you are not. We are going to work with you. You are going to do some kind of, and she guided me to cope with the situation. So this was so relevant. And I think that she helped me, but I'm sure that I helped others, and together we helped each other. So again, normally we have to look at this. Women have to come together. We have to ascend. We have to raise to the top, not alone, because alone we are going to be swallowed by the male environment. We have to be together. So let's support quotas. Let's bring women in bunch. Let's work for women to be not one single person. We are not individuals. We are a group. We are a minority. We have a common agenda. And I'm not the one. I'm just part of a group. And that's how we have to look at this. I was trying to read here the comments. Thank you. I hope we have challenges with language, but I hope we managed to communicate. And I'm always ready to interact with you, those who are in Brazil, and those who are abroad. I hope you really take this challenge to your countries, to your environments, and let's all build together something better for women, but not only for women, for all of us. And that's what we want. Thank you so much. Thank you, Gilberto and Glaucia, for the invitation.